Hello everyone, here I am at the Famine Memorial in Dublin, and right beside the Liffey, there it is. So this is put up in 1999. You see these very gaunt figures, almost skeletal, and she's carrying presumably her infant, and this man with a few possessions. So they're like walking cadavers almost, and it's to commemorate the Great Famine, or many people call it the Great Hunger, which went from 1846 till about 1849. It's debatable when it finished, because of a potato blight which destroyed the staple crop. So there was potato blight across Europe, but it impacted Ireland more heavily than anywhere else. And we were so severely affected because certainly on the Atlantic seaboard it was almost a monoculture. Because potatoes come from South America. Spanish had found them, and I think they were being grown by the Incas in Peru, and then the English later got them and they brought them here to Ireland. That really revolutionised Irish agriculture in the 17th century, because we were semi-nomadic up until that point, following herds of cattle. Obviously you can grow cereal crops like barley and so on, you make whiskey out of that, but often Ireland wasn't great for cereal crops because it's, the atmosphere is just too humid. And on the west coast there's such ferociously howling gales and salt winds, and it's almost treeless. So people living off cattle and sheep and so on. And obviously there is some arable farming, certainly vegetables. It's very well watered, so we luxuriate in the exceptionally verdant pasture, but that's good for some things. But the fantastic thing about potatoes is they grow almost anywhere. They grow at sea level, they grow at high altitude, because there is some limit. They grow in quite dry soil, quite wet soil, thin and stony soil, and you'll get more calories growing a hectare of potatoes than of almost anything else. So that's why our population boomed. I think we forget until the 20th century just what terrible penury people lived in all over the world, and just what we'd consider malnutrition would have been the norm at the time. Anyway, so there had been potato famines in the 18th century when we were a separate kingdom from Great Britain. Not so severe, partly about 1780. The Parliament of Ireland actually banned the export of foodstuffs from Ireland, and that kept the lid on it and mitigated the situation. So people were still starving of death. It just wasn't in huge numbers. Anyway, so we joined the UK on New Year's Day 1801, and our population doubled in 40 years. One of the most rapid population increases anywhere in the world. I mean, to some extent because of potatoes, but other reasons, because we'd already had potatoes for almost 200 years prior to that. But finally, obviously, healthcare improving, sanitation improving, and things like that. But most people were tenant farmers, had to pay their rent by selling extra crops for exports, particularly to Great Britain. And the Industrial Revolution wasn't really taking off here because we had not a single coal mine, very few metals. Anyway, so it was noticed that some of these potatoes were rotting in the ground, were coming up black, were completely inedible. So what were people going to do? And many landlords were completely indifferent to the fate of their tenants and said to the courtiers, well, you've got to pay the rent anyway, I don't care. You can just be evicted. I'll call the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police, to have you put out by the side of the road, and we'll tear down the roof or burn the thatch roof or whatever, so you can't go back there. And things like that. So hunger was turning to starvation in 1846. Now that's one of the reasons why Sir Robert Peel's government repealed the corn laws, because there'd been this higher importation tax on corn from other countries. So that made that a bit more affordable. But if you're indigent anyway, that's not going to make any difference. So there were obviously workhouse and poorhouses. Probably see what they're like in Oliver Twist, but conditions there were deliberately horrific. People held in dishonouring circumstances, deliberately splitting up families, separating siblings, husbands and wives from each other, parents with children. The principle of less eligibility when it came to indoor relief or even outdoor relief. People were only going to go for it if they were in absolutely dire straits. So people in desperate circumstances were turned there. They would have a roof over their heads, they would be kept alive, but it would be as unpleasant as possible, little better than the prison. Remember that the penal code was very harsh in those days. You could be transported to Botany Bay Colony or Van Diemen's Land for trifling offences, petty larceny and so on. There was no longer punishable by death. So some people in the 1840s got so desperate they would steal an item and deliberately hang around to get arrested. They wanted to be caught because if they were incarcerated, they were at least guaranteed a minimum of comestibles. And so in workhouses, even in prisons, they reduced the ration, so people were kept just above the grave. So there was the most terrible hardship. Anyway, so it was a big deal to manage to get the Corn Laws passed, but Peel, about a third of the Tory party split with him, called themselves Peelites, and they formed an alliance with the Whig Party, but that was too little too late for us. Though the government did start buying Indian meal and so on, and soup kitchens were set up and distributing food, but obviously not enough. And so hundreds of thousands of people died of malnutrition, sometimes outright starvation. Some people had nothing to eat at all, other people did have something to eat, but it just wasn't sufficient. So people were doing what they could to eat cockles or mussels or eat seashells, but soon those are stripped bare from coastal areas. Fishing in as much as they could. People were reduced to eating worms or anything like that. Any wild fruits, like berries, those are only available at certain times of year, or mushrooms. Being careful not to eat the ones which are fatal. And there was charity here, and there was charity from Great Britain and elsewhere, and some of the Native Americans sent us food, or even the Ottoman Empire sent us food. I mean, Queen Victoria sent £5,000. There's this lie that she gave like a shilling or something, and said, well, I mustn't be seen as over generous towards my Irish subjects. I'll give an equal amount to Battersea Dogs Home. Battersea Dogs Home, which didn't even exist at the time of the famine. So that is a fallacy put around to besmirch the reputation of our late sovereign lady. Anyway, hundreds of thousands of people died. I mean, I think it's about 800,000. If you look at the census figure in 1841 and the next census in 1851, obviously lots of people emigrated as well. Now, not all the deaths between that period were related to the famine at all, and not all the emigration was related to the famine. There've been significant emigration out of Ireland for about 150 years before that, but it was speeding up anyway, but it sped up a lot more in the late 1840s. And the people who most likely to leave were in their teens or early 20s, as in more mobile, less likely to be married, and wouldn't have lots of dependent children. If they did, just a couple of children. Elderly people less likely to leave, so the people of the most fertile age were leaving the country, and therefore a lot of Irish children were born overseas and not born in Ireland. People left behind, often not marrying, felt they couldn't afford to. Another thing is, up until this time, we had a very early age of marriage and having lots of children. This idea that everybody had 14 children, into the 20th century, well, that's only people who got married very early, and then the average age of marriage became much later. There was a study on this by Malthus, who wrote that essay on the principle of population, saying, well, food supply increases arithmetically, but population increases exponentially, and food supply can't keep up. So that there were two solutions. There was the preventive check, which is getting married late, so having fewer children, or positive check, which was just a crash in the food supply and people starving to death. So we went from being a so-called positive check, I know it's a very callous phrase, as in this is what happened, so many of us died, to being a preventive check society, to the average age of marriage becoming much later. So a lot of people emigrated to the United States, to Canada, to Great Britain and elsewhere. And this memorial here was erected in 1999, and it commemorates people who walked from County Roscommon in the middle of Ireland here to Dublin, and Major Dennis Mahon, who was their landlord, helped them emigrate, and they took ship here, the Liffey, to sail to Coos Isle in Canada, but about a third of them died en route. So some of these people moving had infants, babes in arms, some of them pregnant women and so on. They were all already severely malnourished. There were road works, there were railway works as well, and new docks and so on built to create work for people, but often you had to walk a long distance across Ireland to get work, and then had to work for several days before you got paid and therefore fed. So some people died of starvation and exhaustion before they got a morsel of food. Anyway, it's obviously horrific, seared into the collective consciousness, a terrible trauma that people can never get over. So that is it. There are people who give hugely inflated figures of like 2 million people who died or something, or millions of people who emigrated. Obviously many people continue emigrating to this day, but a lot of that's not attributed to the famine, either directly or indirectly. Anyway, that's just a very brief summary of this. The Great Hunger, or the Famine as some people like to call it. I think it's George Bernard Shaw coined the phrase, the Great Hunger. You read his play, John Bull's Other Island, the stage direction is for one of the characters to say, with a smouldering passion, no, there can be no famine in a country which is exporting lots of food, because tons of food was shipped out of Ireland to Great Britain and elsewhere and sold. Some people still wanted to make a profit, some landlords still insist on their rent being paid. Obviously had some good people here, some charities, some church groups who were saving the lives of their compatriots. Anyway, that's enough from me. Toodaloo.